Yalgar!
What if the last remnant of the Roman Empire, the city that had stood for over 1,000 years, the bridge between East and West, the Second Rome, just fell in 53 days? It is the spring of 1453. A 21-year-old sultan had brought an artillery train, including one of the largest cannons of its time, to the walls of Constantinople. When it fires, the sound shakes the earth for miles. The city trembles, and everyone inside those walls knows what it means. This city was once the richest in the world, the beating heart of a civilization that called itself Roman, not as a ghost of the past, but as a living, breathing empire. For 11 centuries, these walls had never been breached by a foreign enemy through direct assault, not by the Persians, not by the Arabs, not by the Bulgars, though the Crusaders sacked the city in 1204 through betrayal and naval attack. But now, in May 1453, the last Roman emperor, a man named Constantine, like the city's founder, stands on those walls and watches the cannons line up outside. He has perhaps 7,000 to 8,000 soldiers to defend 14 miles of walls, though military sources vary. The Byzantine chronicler George Sfranz, a close advisor to Constantine, recorded only 4,773. They were Greeks, plus another 200 foreigners, likely undercounting mercenaries. The enemy has roughly 80,000 to 100,000. And of course, here estimates range from 50 to 200,000 in contemporary accounts. On May 29, 1453, after 53 days of bombardment, the city that had withstood so many sieges finally fell to direct assault, and the world was never the same. This is the story of the fall of Constantinople, a pivotal battle that marked the symbolic end of the Middle Ages and the rise of gunpowder empires. The siege that reshaped trade, religion, and the balance of power across 3 continents. One city's end that accelerated changes already underway in the world. But before we move on with the battle itself, let's go back to the beginning. To understand what fell in 1453, you have to understand what Constantinople was, not just in 1453, but across 1,000 years of history. In the year 330, the Roman Emperor Constantine I moved his capital east. He chose a strategic peninsula at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, where the Bosporus Strait connects the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, and built there one of the greatest cities in human history. He named it Constantinople, the new Rome. While the western half of the Roman Empire collapsed in the 400s under barbarian pressure, the eastern half held. It kept Roman law, Roman administration, Roman titles, even as its language gradually became predominantly Greek, and its Christianity evolved distinctly from Rome's. Historians call it the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines themselves call it simply the Roman Empire. To them, they were Rome, they were Romans. At its height, under Justinian the Great in the 6th century, this empire stretched from parts of Spain to Mesopotamia. It preserved Greek philosophy when Western Europe had largely forgotten it. It produced the Justinian's Code, the legal foundation of modern European law. The Hagia Sophia, built in 537, was for nearly 1,000 years the largest cathedral on earth, a building so magnificent that visiting Russian ambassadors reportedly said, "We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth." But history is not kind to empires, and the Byzantines suffered century after century. The Arab conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries stripped away Egypt, Syria, and the Holy Land. The Bulgarians and Slavs pressed from the north. Then came the Crusaders. In 1204, and this still shocks people, the Fourth Crusade, which was supposed to fight Muslims in Egypt, instead sacked Constantinople. Christian crusaders attacking the greatest Christian city in the world. They looted the Hagia Sophia, they melted down holy relics, they installed a Latin emperor. For nearly 60 years, Constantinople was under Western occupation. Eyewitness Geoffrey de Villehardouin described the sack as a scene of a massacre and pillage, where so much booty had never been gained in any city since the creation of the world. The Byzantines reclaimed their city in 1261 under the Palaiologos dynasty. But they reclaimed a shadow. The treasury was empty, the army was a ghost. The population had shrunk from hundreds of thousands to perhaps 50,000 by 1453. Vast territories were gone. And now a new threat was rising in the east. In 1299, a Turkish chieftain named Osman I founded a small principality in northwestern Anatolia. His descendants, the Ottomans, would prove to be among the most capable empire builders in history. By the 1350s, they had crossed into Europe, taking Gallipoli in 1354. By the 1400s, they controlled most of the Balkans after crushing a crusader army at Nicopolis in 1396. Constantinople, this once great metropolis, was now a walled Christian island surrounded by a Muslim sea. By 1453, the Byzantine Empire was essentially just Constantinople, the city itself, plus a handful of outposts in Greece and the Peloponnese. A city-state claiming to be an empire, about 50,000 people, soldiers and civilians combined, huddled behind the ancient Theodosian Walls, surrounded on three sides by Ottoman territory and on the fourth by the sea. The empire that had given the world Justinian's Code, the Hagia Sophia, and preserved Greek learning through the darkest centuries was now a ghost haunting its own walls. And then, in 1451, a young man named Mehmed II came to the throne of the Ottoman Empire. He was 19 years old, and from the moment he became Sultan, he had one obsession: Constantinople. Islamic tradition held that the Prophet Muhammad had promised the best leader is the one who conquers Constantinople. Mehmed intended to be that leader. He had tried and briefly besieged the city at age 15 in 1446. But now he was Sultan, and this time he would not fail. What made Mehmed II so dangerous wasn't just ambition, it was method. He was a scholar who read military history in multiple languages, including Greek and Latin. He studied the previous failed sieges of Constantinople and asked, why did they fail? And what would it take to succeed? The answer, he concluded, was firepower, specifically an artillery train capable of breaching walls that had stood for 1,000 years. And here enter Orban, often called Urban, a Hungarian or Transylvanian engineer. Some sources say he had previously offered his services to the Byzantines. Constantinople famously couldn't afford him, so Orban went to Mehmed, and Mehmed paid him whatever he asked. What Orban built was staggering, called the Basilica or Dardanelles gun. It was approximately 27 feet long. It fired stone balls weighing over 600 kilograms. That's over 1,300 pounds, at a distance of more than a mile. It required 60 oxen and 400 men to move. It could only be fired 7 times a day because it needed hours to cool between shots, and every time it fired, the ground shook. Windows shattered inside the city, and people ran to churches to pray. But it was just one cannon. Mehmed had dozens more of various sizes, totaling around 70 guns, marking an early example of massed artillery in siege warfare. Mehmed didn't rely on just cannons. He assembled an army totaling somewhere between 80 to 100,000 men. Estimates vary. with Venetian eyewitness Niccolò Barbaro reporting 160,000, while France cites 200,000. At the core of his army were the Janissaries, elite infantry, often Christian boys taken as children via the Devshirme system, trained from youth, fiercely loyal, some of the finest soldiers of the age. Alongside them, Anatolian and Balkan cavalry, irregular troops called Bashi Bazouks, and a navy of roughly 126 vessels to blockade the city from the sea. Mehmed also built the fortress of Rumeli Hisar on the European side of the Bosphorus in 1452, pairing it with Anadolu Hisar on the Asian side to control the strait and cut off the Black Sea supplies to Constantinople. And what did Constantinople have? About 7,000 to 8,000 defenders, including civilians and mercenaries. Constantine XI, dignified, brave, and utterly realistic about his dire situation, did everything humanly possible. He hired Genoese mercenaries, most notably a brilliant commander named Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, who brought 700 men and would prove indispensable. He stockpiled food, oil, and materials for wall repair. He stretched a massive iron chain across the mouth of the Golden Horn, the inlet north of the city, to block the Ottoman fleet from attacking that flank. He sent desperate diplomatic appeals to the west. The Pope sent Cardinal Isidore of Kiev with 200 archers. Venice promised ships but delayed. Genoa kept one eye on its trade interest in Pera or Galata. No major crusade materialized. The great powers of Christendom watched, waited, and made excuses. Historian Stephen Runciman, in his seminal The Fall of Constantinople 1453, notes the West was not unwilling to help, but it was fatally slow. On the night before the siege began, something remarkable happened inside the Hagia Sophia. For a century, the Byzantine Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church had been bitterly divided, split over theology. For a century, the Byzantine Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church had been bitterly divided, split over theology, politics, and pride. But in December 1452, months before the Ottoman army arrived, Orthodox and Catholic Christians had prayed together in the Great Cathedral as part of efforts to reunite the two churches. Now, in these final days, they did so again. Whatever theological differences had separated them, this was their last liturgy together. Constantine himself prayed there. Many people in that church knew it might be their last prayer anywhere. Then Constantine walked the walls, said farewell to his commanders, and prepared for what was coming. On April 2nd, Mehmed's army arrives and camps outside the walls. On April 6th, the Ottomans open fire. The sound was unlike anything the defenders had experienced before. The basilica cannon could be heard for miles. Each shot opened cracks and craters in walls that had stood since the 5th century. The Theodosian Walls, triple-layered, studded with towers, fronted by a moat, were the finest fortifications in the medieval world. But they had been built for an era before gunpowder. Venetian eyewitness Niccolò Barbaro described the bombardment. The Turks were firing their great cannon, which fired a ball weighing 1,200 pounds, and their arrows all along the length of the walls. Night after night, the Byzantines worked furiously to repair the damage. They packed rubble and timber into the breaches. They hung bales of wool and leather to absorb the impact of cannonballs. They poured boiling oil on Ottoman soldiers who tried to scale the damaged sections. The walls held, barely, and the defenders held with them. Mehmed tried everything. On April 11th, he ordered mining operations, tunnel dug under the walls to collapse them from below. The Byzantines employed a counter-mining team led by a Scottish engineer named John Grant. According to some sources, digging their own tunnels to intercept the Ottoman ones. Underground, by torchlight, men fought and died in cramped tunnels beneath the city. The Ottoman navy attempted to force the chain across the Golden Horn on April 9 and again on April 20th, but failed. The chain held. Giustiniani led counterattacks at every breach. Morale inside the city against all odds remained high, fueled by religious fervor, by faith in their walls, and by the charisma of their emperor. A naval skirmish on April 20th boosted spirits. 4 Christian ships, 3 Genoese, 1 Byzantine, broke through the Ottoman blockade, sinking several Turkish vessels and delivering supplies. Barbaro recounted, "Our ships fought so bravely that they sank many Turkish galleys." On the night of April 21st and 22nd, the Ottomans did something that seemed impossible. They dragged 70 ships over land, hauled on greased logs and rollers over the hills north of the city, from the Bosporus around Galata into the Golden Horn, bypassing the chain entirely. Barbaro marveled. This was a most astonishing feat in a single night. In a single night, Constantinople's northern flank was suddenly threatened. The defenders now had to split their already thin forces to cover an entirely new front. This was a psychological blow as much as a tactical one. It said, "Nothing you have prepared for us matters. We will find a way." But the city held week after week. Assaults on April 18 and May 7 to the 12th were repelled. By mid-May, Mehmed's advisors were urging him to consider a negotiated settlement. They worried about the morale of the besieging army. They worried about crusading fleets that might arrive. They worried about time. Constantine was offered terms: surrender the city peacefully, keep his life, perhaps keep his throne as an Ottoman vassal, or retreat to the Morea. His response, recorded by France, was resolute. "To surrender the city to you is beyond my authority or anyone else who lives in it. For all of us, after taking the mutual decision, shall die out of free will without sparing our lives." Inside the city, the mood was grim. Food supplies were dwindling, the defenders were exhausted after nearly 7 weeks of continuous siege. And then came the omens, as recorded by multiple eyewitnesses. A blood-red lunar eclipse on May 22nd, strange lights seen above the Hagia Sophia's dome on May 24th, a fog on May 26th that was read as the departure of the Holy Spirit from the city. People remembered prophecies. They prayed harder. They repaired walls by night, held them by day, and waited. Barbaro noted the whole city was filled with lamentation. On the dawn of May 29, 1453, Mehmed ordered his full army to stand down for 2 days before the final assault. Rest, pray, prepare. He walked among his troops personally and told them, "Tomorrow we take the city." He promised them 3 days of plunder, the traditional right of an army that takes a city by storm. Greek historian Michael Critoboulos, writing in Ottoman service, quotes Mehmed's speech. "My friends and men of my empire, you all know very well that the city of Constantinople is the center of the Romans, who have always been our enemies." On the night of May 28, inside Constantinople, Constantine XI held a last gathering of his commanders. According to France, he delivered a stirring speech. "Gentlemen, illustrious captain of the army, and our most Christian lords, I know that the hour has come where the ancient hatred of the infidel against our nation must find its satisfaction. Let us then, my comrades, fight with all our might. God forbid that I should live as an emperor without an empire. As my city falls, I will fall with it. Whosoever wishes to escape, let him save himself if he can. And whoever is ready to face death, let him follow me." He asked for forgiveness from anyone he had ever wronged. Then he rode to the walls. Just after midnight, May 29th, Mehmed launched his assault. It came in waves. First wave, the Bashi Bazouks, irregular troops, expendable shock troops sent first to exhaust the defenders and probe for weaknesses. They were fierce, undisciplined, unarmored. The Byzantines repelled them after brutal fighting, but the defenders were already tired. Barbaro described, "They tried to raise the ladders up, and at once we threw them to the ground. Anyone who approached beneath the walls was killed." Second wave, Anatolian infantry, better armed, better disciplined. They hit the most damaged sections of the walls near the Lycus River Valley, where the Basilica cannon had done its worst work. Hour after hour, they pressed. Hour after hour, they were thrown back. Inside the city, bells were ringing. Every church, every monastery calling the civilian population to pray. Third wave, the Janissaries. Fresh, rested, elite. The finest soldiers in the Ottoman army. They advanced in perfect formation to the sound of drums and pipes. This was the moment Mehmed had been saving them for. Barbaro wrote, "They attacked the walls with such shouting and clashing of percussion that it seemed a thing not of this world." For a time, the exhausted Byzantine defenders held even them. Giustiniani was everywhere, rallying, repositioning, holding the line through sheer force of will. And then, exactly when it mattered most, Giustiniani was wounded. A bolt, possibly a crossbow or early firearm, pierced a gap in his armor around 4 a.m. The wound was serious. He told Constantine he needed to withdraw for treatment. Constantine begged him to stay. Giustiniani insisted. He was carried through the city gate, and with him went the heart of the defense. The Genoese troops who saw their commander leave began to waver, and at that moment, whether by betrayal or simple chaos, a small postern gate called the Kerkoporta was found open, left unlatched in the confusion of the fighting. A group of Janissaries forced their way through. They raised an Ottoman banner from a tower above the walls. Defenders who saw it thought the city had fallen. Some fled. Panic spread along the ramparts. The Janissaries outside poured through every breach. Constantine XI, the last Roman emperor, saw what was happening. He tore off his imperial insignia, he drew his sword, and he charged. He was never seen again. His body was never definitely identified. Eyewitness accounts vary. Sfranz implies he died in the melee. Barbaro claimed he hanged himself. Critobulus wrote, "The Emperor Constantine, with all who were with him, fell in gallant combat." Leonardo Chios, another eyewitness. The emperor then, seeking to avoid capture, cried, "Which of my brave young soldiers will run me through now with my own sword?" He survived battling against the press of the Turks and was cleft in two by an axe. One legend holds that he was spirited away, turned to marble, sleeping beneath the city, waiting to return when he is needed. By mid-morning, the city was falling street by street. Soldiers and civilians fled toward the harbor, toward the Hagia Sophia, praying for a miracle. Ottoman forces poured through the gates and over the walls. Thousands of civilians had crowded into the Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral, trusting in the legend that an angel would appear to defend it if the city ever fell. The doors were barred. The people prayed. The Ottoman soldiers broke down the doors by Islamic law because the city had been taken by force rather than surrendered. 3 days of plunder were permitted. Looting began. Civilians inside the Hagia Sophia were enslaved or killed. An anonymous eyewitness described the sack. "Nothing will ever equal the horror of this harrowing and terrible spectacle." The enraged Turkish soldiers gave no quarter. That afternoon, Sultan Mehmed II rode through the city to the Hagia Sophia. He dismounted, he entered the cathedral. He bent down and picked up a handful of earth and put it over his head, an act of humility before God. Witnessing a soldier hammering at the marble floor, Mehmed asked what he was doing. "It is for the faith," the soldier said. Mehmed struck him down. "Be satisfied with the booty and the captives. The buildings of the city belong to me." Then he ordered that the bells be removed, the Christian icons taken down, and the cathedral immediately consecrated as a mosque. An imam climbed to where the altar had been and called the prayer. The city the Byzantines called Constantinople, Mehmed renamed Constantinople, who was later renamed Istanbul. May 29, 1453 is not just a date in a history textbook. It is by many measures a hinge on which the medieval world swung toward the modern one. Constantinople had been the gateway between East and West for centuries. The Silk Road's western terminus was the funnel through which spices, silks, and luxury goods flowed from Asia to Europe. When the Ottomans took the city, they controlled access and levied taxes. European merchants began desperately searching for alternative routes to Asia, accelerating efforts already in motion. It became clear that Constantinople would fall, and after it did, Byzantine scholars fled westward, primarily to Italy, carrying manuscripts with them, Greek texts that Western Europe had not read in centuries. Plato, Aristotle, mathematics, medicine, philosophy. These manuscripts poured into Florence, Venice, and Rome, and exactly the moment Italian humanists were hungry for them. The influx of Greek learning accelerated the Renaissance. Though some texts had already arrived before 1453 via trade and earlier refugees. Runciman notes, the fall gave a great stimulus to the study of Greek in the West. The Ottoman artillery train proved something terrifying. Medieval stone fortifications, no matter how thick, they could not withstand sustained cannon fire. Military architecture had to be completely reinvented. Lower, wider, earth-backed fortifications designed to absorb cannonballs rather than repel climbers. The fall of the last great Christian city in the East sent shockwaves through Europe. Calls for a new crusade went up, mostly unanswered. Russia, meanwhile, began to position itself as the inheritor of Byzantine tradition. Moscow as the Third Rome, the Russian Orthodox Church as the heir of a Byzantine Christianity. The Byzantine Empire had been, in an unbroken chain, the continuation of the Roman Empire. When Constantine XI died on those walls, the last emperor of Rome died with him, over 1,000 years after the founding of Rome. The Roman story finally, definitely ended. The Ottoman Empire that took Constantinople went on to become one of the greatest empires the world had ever seen. Mehmed II, now called the Conqueror, conquered much of the Balkans and Greece, including Athens in 1456 and the Morea in 1460. His great-grandson, Suleiman the Magnificent, would press to the very gates of Vienna in 1529. Control North Africa and rule a realm stretching from Hungary to the Persian Gulf. In Western Europe, the shock eventually faded. The crusading impulse sputtered on for a few more generations, then essentially died. European powers made their accommodations with the Ottoman Empire, traded with it, allied with it, as France did in 1536, and feared it. The Ottomans were a permanent feature on European geopolitics for 4 more centuries. And what about the Byzantine legacy? Well, it lived on in preserved texts, artistic traditions, theological lineages, and legal frameworks. The Russian claim to be the Third Rome shaped the Romanov dynasty and Russian foreign policy. The Greek Orthodox Church maintained its identity through centuries of Ottoman rule, and the great libraries of Italy, filled with manuscripts rescued from Constantinople, helped fuel the intellectual explosion that we call the Renaissance. Everything was so close. That's what haunts you when you study the siege. It was so close. What if, in an alternative history, Giustiniani holds his wound for one more hour, or the Kerkoporta Gate is latched, or a Venetian fleet arrives 2 weeks earlier? Any one of 100 small moments breaks differently, and the Ottoman army, exhausted after 53 days, begins to fracture. Mehmed's advisors, who had already been urging him to negotiate, finally win the argument, and the siege is lifted. Well, hypothetically, what happens next? Picture Constantinople in the summer of 1453, battered, half-starved, its walls cracked and patched with rubble, but standing. Constantine XI rides through the streets to the Hagia Sophia, the bells ring, the city has survived. But survival is not revival. Let's be clear about that. The treasury is empty. The population is a fracture of what it once was. The army that just defended the walls numbers in the thousands, not the tens of thousands. They were really small. Byzantine Constantinople, even victorious, is a wounded animal. Still surrounded by Ottoman territory, still dependent on Genoese and Venetian goodwill, still ignored by the kings of Western Europe who sent letters of encouragement and very little else. Mehmed, though, does not give up. He's 21 years old and burning with ambition. He would try again, perhaps in 1458 or in 62. He has learned from the first attempt and he comes back stronger. But a Byzantine survival in 1453 changes the political weather in Europe. A successful defense sends a very different message than a fall. It says the Ottomans are not invincible, and that buys time. Time for a crusading coalition to form. Time for Hungary and Venice and the papacy to coordinate in a way they never managed when the city was already burning. Now, you might fairly ask, was Constantinople even the reason the Ottomans controlled the Balkans? Much of their conquest happened before 1453. Serbia had fallen at Kosovo in 1389. Bulgaria was gone in 1396. The Ottomans didn't need Constantinople to project power into southeastern Europe. They've been doing it for a century already. And that's true. The city was not the key that unlocked the Balkans. The Balkans were already largely lost before the walls came down. What Constantinople gave the Ottomans was consolidation, a capital, a base of legitimacy, the seat of empire, the city of Caesar, now theirs. It was more the fall of a symbol. It transformed the Ottoman state from a powerful frontier sultanate into something that looked and felt like a true successor empire. It anchored their European holdings, gave their navy a home, and made their control of southeastern Europe permanent rather than provisional. So in our alternate timeline, the Balkans are still mostly Ottoman. That doesn't change. What changes is the nature and duration of that control, and whether it even hardens into the kind of settled generational dominion that forged those identities so deeply. A Constantinople that bleeds Ottoman resources, that keeps a crusading threat credible, that gives Balkan resistance movements a symbol and a potential ally. That's a different Balkans, even if the borders look similar on a map. Maybe not a different 20th century, but a different path to it. And perhaps that's the honest answer to all these counterfactuals. Constantinople's fall didn't cause the age of exploration or the Renaissance or the wars of the Balkans, not alone, not directly. History doesn't work that way. The forces behind all of those things were already in motion. What 1453 did was acceleration, crystallization, slam a door shut on one world that forced everyone to find new ones. A Byzantine survival doesn't prevent that. It delays it, complicates it, and sends it down a different path or different roads. But different roads lead to different places, and we will never know where those roads went. One unlatched gate, one wounded commander, and the map of the modern world drawn differently, or perhaps just drawn in a different hand. One city's fall reshaped the world. Even if he had not fallen, the consequences would likely have been delayed rather than entirely avoided. In closing, Constantinople did not fall in a day, it fell over centuries, in the looting of 1204 by the Crusaders, in the slow bleeding of territory, in the empty treasury, in unanswered letters to Western kings. May 29, 1453 was just the final stroke. An empire over 1,000 years old ended, not in a slow fade, but in 53 days of thunder and fire. And one emperor who chose to die with his city rather than flee it. A new empire rose in its place, brilliant, complex, and equally worth understanding. And the world tilting forward toward exploration, toward print, gunpowder empires, toward the Renaissance, became the world we recognize today. I will see you on the next battlefield. Bye.